Hi, and welcome to this latest edition of our TechLaw series. I'm Maria Fitzpatrick, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues Claire O'Brien and Sarah Kelly. And we are here today to talk about the EU Digital Decade. So, the EU Digital Decade is a strategic initiative aimed at guiding the digital transformation of Europe by 2030. It's designed to show the EU's commitment to a human-centric, secure, safe and sustainable digital transformation. And the driver behind the initiative is to empower citizens and businesses and to promote economic growth. So, Sarah, can you tell us how the EU proposes to do that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So by 2030, the European Parliament, Member States and the European Commission have set concrete objectives and targets in 4 key areas aimed at the development of the digital economy. So these 4 key areas are digital skills, digital infrastructure, the digitalisation of public services, and digital transformation of businesses. So to give you some examples of what that means, under the EU Digital Skills Initiative, the aim is to ensure that at least 80% of the population has basic digital skills. In terms of the digital transformation of businesses, the EU's aim is to encourage 75% of companies in the EU to use advanced digital technologies like cloud computing, AI, and big data, and also double the number of EU unicorns.
Thanks, Sarah. And so we know that the EU is actively monitoring progress against these goals in a number of ways. For example, we've seen the Commission publish its annual report in which it evaluates progress and provides recommendations for actions. And the latest status report came out in July 2024. So, Sarah, what did that report show in terms of the progress that has been made against the goals you've mentioned?
Yeah, so interestingly, the report showed that the EU is significantly behind in the achievement of its targets. The uptake of AI, cloud, and big data by European companies was well below the digital decade target, which was 75%. Although the results show that progress varies greatly across individual member states, so that's not the case everywhere.
Okay, so very interesting. And we know the Commission emphasises that the adoption and development of innovative technologies is crucial for Europe's competitiveness, particularly with the current geopolitical landscape and increasing cybersecurity threats and putting demands on enhanced resilience and robust security measures. And it's not surprising that there's variances between member states, although there's an emphasis on the whole of the EU getting behind this initiative, and countries are incentivized to participate in multi-country projects, to pool investments and to launch large-scale cross-border projects in areas like data infrastructure, 5G, quantum computing, among others. And we'll definitely be eagerly awaiting this year's progress report to be published. So, Claire, Sarah has outlined the aims of the digital decade from an innovation perspective. Could you tell us about the regulatory impact of the EU digital decade?
Sure. So the digital decade involves a package of regulatory reforms aimed at supporting the safe and secure development of the digital economy, as Sarah described. Digital regulation isn't new. We've been living with things like data protection regulation, the enforcement and development of which has been maturing, from the Data Protection Directive through to GDPR. And so organizations are to a certain extent well used to that. But you could actually now just view GDPR as being the very basic, foundation or core piece of legislation that almost every organization in any sector will need to take account of and comply with now in order to do business. Given, I suppose, that almost every sector has become so digitized and data driven. But we now have entire business models that are entirely digital and database that didn't exist, 20 or even 10 years ago. So what we see now with the digital decade is a raft of new legislation that's more specifically tailored to deal with the unique risks that are brought about by the digitization of the economy. So, as you said, cyber resilience and security in the financial services sectors and for essential services, accessibility and safety of digital content, data altruism, data governance, regulating AI. The proliferation really of these pieces of legislation is intended to modernise the EU regulatory framework to reflect the shift towards an economy that's innovative, digitised and data-based. So as you can imagine, the idea of an entire suite of new regulations that so many global businesses will need to comply with is being perceived as potentially quite a lift for certain companies.
Very interesting, Claire. Thank you for that. And the raft of legislation that you refer to really does underpin the Digital Decade Strategy. As you say, it really sets the regulatory framework, and we're talking here about covering key areas like data, privacy, cybersecurity, digital services, and AI. And there's so much that we could discuss here. Like we've got the Data Act, the Cybersecurity Act, DORA, NIS2, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and the EU AI Act. But the one that is getting a lot of focus right now is, of course, the EU AI Act, not least because of its extraterritorial effect. So why don't we just focus on that one for now? I think it's fair to say that the EU is becoming known for setting digital trends with global effect, stemming from our beloved GDPR. So Claire, can you tell us about that? Like, what is the Margaret's reaction to the AI Act?
Sure. Yeah. So the EU AI Act is definitely, a real flagship piece of legislation coming from this Digital Decade initiative, and it's obviously been, the subject of a lot of industry and legal attention and debate. So it's the first mandatory, horizontal piece of legislation regulating AI in the world, and it represents and reflects the EU's approach to regulation. As you mentioned, they're having that extraterritorial effect. Some of the debate around it, especially at the moment, is really illustrating this dichotomy between, a perception of over-regulation versus competitiveness and the effect on innovation, that the Digital Decade is trying to achieve. And actually, just this week, the EU is now launching a new AI strategy aimed at competitiveness, and which might actually include some simplification of the regulation, although it's not exactly clear yet what that's going to entail. So the EU institutions, they are emphasizing, I guess, the importance of legal certainty, so trying to maybe not necessarily make too many amendments to legislation that is already out there, but that's not necessarily off the table either. We have already seen the European Commission withdrawing the AI liability directive from the suite of AI regulation that was initially proposed. And it is the case now that we'll mainly be relying on the product liability directive to deal with the liability regime from the AI perspective. So there's definitely, maybe a move towards looking at more streamlined ways of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our clients represent global organizations, and so they'll be really interested to hear whether or how the EU approach differs from other regimes, and how do they approach AI compliance when they're faced with this patchwork of laws.
Yeah, so just, I suppose, to touch on a few of the other approaches that are being taken around the world. So the UK, for example, is taking a much more principles-based kind of framework approach, relying on existing regulatory regimes to regulate AI. On the US side, we're seeing a lot of activity at the moment. The new administration, for example, rescinding some orders that were made under the previous administration relating to AI. But not necessarily, looking at a comprehensive federal, regulatory regime there. From the Asia Pac perspective, there's obviously, very differing approaches from country to country. South Korea, for example, does now have a comprehensive horizontal AI Act in place. And China, on the other hand, is kind of mostly taking a sectoral approach. So while globally, though, the outlook can seem quite fractured from a legislative perspective, I think it's useful to focus on the fact that most of the regimes tend to look at AI from a risk classification perspective. Most of the scrutiny and restrictions and guardrails applying to higher risk use cases. And that's actually already how businesses tend to view new technologies, through the lens of risk classification and management. So from my perspective, I think I like to think of there'll be two types of organizations now looking closely at compliance with the AI Act. So firstly, organizations involved in the supply of products and services that are already regulated under the EU suite of product safety legislation. So they'll already be very well versed in things like, the concepts of placing high-risk products onto the EU market, CE marking, conformity assessment, post-market surveillance, and the EU AI Act all leverages these existing concepts from that body of product safety legislation. It just overlays, I guess, the AI risk and the risks relating to human rights on top of those regimes. There'll also be organizations who never necessarily had to deal with product safety legislation before, but they are very data driven. And so they're already used to dealing with and they're well versed in the concepts that are embedded in data protection law, data governance, risk assessment, risk management, and the human rights aspect from the data perspective. So both types of organizations really can leverage existing processes and procedures to deal with the AI risk, and not just from an EU AI Act perspective, but taking a holistic view of the risk and opportunity that AI can present.
Thanks, Claire. I think it'll be very reassuring to businesses that they don't need to start from a blank page here and get overwhelmed by the AI Act. I think, unsurprisingly, the 2024 edition of our DLA Piper Tech Index report, where we bring together the global perspective on the tech sector, showed that AI is definitely dominating the agenda of most organizations. And so I think we all agree that all eyes are on its implementation and indeed enforcement. And speaking of enforcement, given the approach to enforcement is one of the key aspects of the regulatory landscape, Sarah, can you tell us what approach is being taken or likely to be taken, given a lot of the legislation underpinning the EU Digital Decade has recently come into force or will be enforced in the very near future?
Yeah, of course. So as Claire mentioned, and Maria, I've heard you refer to it before as the beloved GDPR. So, this piece of legislation has been enforced now for several years, and we have a clear picture of enforcement trends. We're seeing regulators adopt an assertive approach in terms of regulating GDPR. But then there's other pieces of legislation under the EU Digital Decade where an enforcement picture just isn't clear yet. And one of those, of course, is the AI Act. So while we don't know yet how the AI Act will be enforced, there is a lot for companies to consider. And of course, part of that is who will be responsible for enforcing the AI Act, and of course, the timeline for enforcement.
So Sarah, can you tell us a bit more about that from the EU level and the national level? Who will be the responsible authorities with enforcement powers?
Yeah, so as you said, Claire, the AI Act will be enforced at both EU and national level, and that depends on the type of AI in question. So firstly, looking at AI systems, these will largely be regulated at a national level by designated national competent authorities. So interestingly, certain countries have opted to establish a dedicated AI regulator. Spain is one of these countries, for example, whereas others, such as here in Ireland, have implemented a distributed model of regulation. So in Ireland, we have adopted a sectoral approach, and just recently the government designated 8 competent authorities, including the Central Bank of Ireland, which will have oversight of AI applications in the financial services sector. Other competent authorities here include the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission and the Data Protection Commission. So these bodies will each play a role in enforcing the AI Act in their relevant sectors. Turning to the provisions regulating the general purpose AI models, these will be enforced centrally by the EU AI Office. And then for high-risk AI systems, these will also be subject to scrutiny by national public authorities, which will focus on the protection of fundamental rights. So these bodies have specific powers to access AI documentation, conduct technical assessments, and request compliance testing on high-risk AI systems. In countries such as Ireland that implement a distributed model of regulation, a lead authority will be designated to coordinate the enforcement of the AI Act at a national level. So in any one EU country, there may be several regulators responsible for enforcing the AI Act, to be coordinated then by a lead authority, in addition to enforcement of certain GPAI provisions by the AI office at an EU level. So there's a lot going on.
Sure. And how's it being enforced at the moment, given, certain aspects of it are already in force?
Yeah, so the AI Act entered into force in 2024, but in recognition of the fact that member states would require time to set up governance structures, for example, those relevant authorities that I mentioned, the Act provides for phased implementation. The AI Act sets out different application dates for different provisions. So prohibited AI systems have been banned since February 2025 due to the unacceptable level of risk that they posed. For example, this would be emotion recognition in the workplace and education settings. That's been banned since February. From August 2025, obligations for providers of general purpose AI will apply. And then it is not until August 2026 that the remaining provisions on high-risk AI systems used, for example, for creditworthiness assessments and other high-risk areas such as law enforcement will then apply. So with this phased implementation, while national competent authorities have been designated in some member states, there is uncertainty regarding when regulators will be able to enforce the AI Act, particularly in relation to their investigatory powers of the national competent authorities and the AI office. This is because the Act does not specify an early application date for certain of these powers, and therefore the default application date of August 2026 will apply. So what this means is during the interim period where certain obligations apply to the providers of AI, depending on the type of AI in question, regulators may not be entitled to investigate or enforce the AI Act for non-compliance.
And just wondering, is there any guidance at the moment as to what companies should be doing in the interim?
So the EU AI office has not issued specific guidance on the enforcement powers of these regulators during this interim period, but there has been a lot of reporting on this issue recently. And if we look at the approach that was adopted to the enforcement of prohibited AI practices that were banned since February, the EU AI office confirmed that during this period, in the absence of national regulators, the prohibitions themselves had direct effect and could therefore be enforced by parties in national courts, for example, by seeking interim injunctions against prohibited practices. So the EU AI office has made it clear that they intend to continue to publish guidance to facilitate and promote the use of AI as part of this EU digital decade. So we can be hopeful that they will issue guidance on this point at some point in the near future.
Whoa, there's a lot going on. Thank you to you both, Sarah and Claire. And I mean, there's so much more I think we could discuss here on just the AI Act itself. And businesses are grappling not only with this, but with the rest of the raft of legislation that we mentioned earlier. Claire, you mentioned the dichotomy between the perception of over-regulation versus competitiveness. And the EU has been heavily criticised both by industry and other countries outside of the EU just for the sheer volume of regulation being enacted, some saying it is a barrier to innovation and competitiveness. And what is the message from the Commission on this, Claire?
So the message really from the Commission is that a clear regulatory landscape is intended to create a robust framework that provides certainty for businesses to grow and innovate and levels the playing field. The rule book is the same for everyone. And interestingly, the DLA Piper Tech Index report that you mentioned earlier supports the Commission's view as well. So it shows actually a positive outlook from the tech sector. and they're perceiving the regulatory landscape as an opportunity for innovation and growth rather than being seen as a barrier. So we're actually working with clients regularly on streamlining business approaches to compliance strategically across the suite of digital decade legislation, to try and to try and harness that opportunity.
Thanks, Claire. I think we'll probably wrap up there. We've covered quite a lot, and I think it's fair to say that there's certainly a lot for us to keep an eye on at the moment across the whole of the legislative package underpinning the EU Digital Decade, and we as a firm are doing just that. Interestingly, like you say, Claire, there's key themes pervading throughout the Digital Decade legislative package, which example, transparency, security, etc. There's others. And we've touched here on some of the complexities of the very topical EU AI Act, and complexities that will need to be overcome to facilitate and promote the use of AI as part of the EU Digital Decade and allow for those 2030 goals we've discussed to be achieved. And we've mentioned briefly the other pieces of legislation that form part of this package, and there's so much more to discuss on those, so watch out for further episodes on those. But I guess to end on a positive note, we can take comfort from the positive outlook being shown by the tech sector. With change comes opportunity, and the legislative package really does set the rules and parameters within which businesses can operate. So taking away some of the unknowns and risks of further legislation coming down the track. And so those businesses who create a robust governance framework aligning with the key themes pervading throughout the digital decade will inevitably be strides ahead of their competitors.